At 3:17 a.m. Tehran time, an all-Iranian-built Kausar fighter jet took off from the Isfahan airbase under total radio silence. 6 minutes later, Israeli radars on the Syrian border detected a signature that technically shouldn't exist. It wasn't a US F-35 stealth fighter, nor was it a cutting-edge Russian Su-35. It was something Pentagon analysts had dismissed for years as Iranian propaganda. It was a fourth-generation fighter developed with domestic technology that had just done something that would force a complete re-evaluation of the air power balance in the Middle East. As Israeli commanders scrambled interception protocols and F-35I fighters launched from Ramon Base in the Negev, Iranian engineers in underground bunkers monitored telemetry data that would prove more valuable than any direct military operation. What happened in the next 34 minutes not only defied decades of Western technological superiority, but exposed an uncomfortable truth Washington would prefer to keep buried. While the United States spent $7 trillion developing the F-35, strategic adversaries were finding asymmetric ways to neutralize that advantage for an infinitesimal fraction of the cost. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now is the time to hit that subscribe button, because what we're about to reveal about this operation will completely change your understanding of who truly dominates military technology in the 21st century. To grasp the magnitude of what transpired that early morning, we need to rewind 18 months to when the Kausar program was treated by the Western intelligence community as an elaborate joke. CIA reports classified the project as ingenuity theater, an attempt by the Iranian regime to mask its technological inferiority with bombastic claims and choreographed demonstrations. Rand Corporation analysts published papers arguing that Iran lacked the industrial capacity to produce high-performance turbines, integrated avionics systems, or ESA radars that could compete with Western or Russian platforms. The dominant narrative was clear. Nations under heavy sanctions simply cannot develop modern fighter jets without access to global supply chains, without direct technology transfer from established powers, without decades of accumulated experience that only the United States, Russia, China, and a few European allies possessed. This narrative has just been shattered by a fighter jet that cost $25 million to develop and produce, compared to the $80 million per unit for an F-35A. But it wasn't just a matter of cost. It was a matter of a completely different strategic approach that exposed the fundamental weaknesses of the American model of weapons systems development. What makes the 3:17 a.m. incident absolutely revolutionary isn't that the Kausar is superior to the F-35 in raw specifications of speed, altitude, or armament. It's not. The F-35 still holds clear advantages in stealth, integrated avionics, and network capability with other systems. But here's what truly matters, and this is where the story completely turns. The Kausar was designed specifically to exploit the systemic vulnerabilities of the F-35, not to compete with it in a traditional dogfight. During those 34 minutes over Syrian airspace, the Iranian fighter executed a sequence of maneuvers that forced the Israeli F-35Is to activate their active radars in continuous tracking mode, sacrificing their stealth signature to maintain a lock on the target. Here's the diabolical genius of the Iranian strategy. While the Kausar deliberately emitted a high radar signature, making itself appear an easy target that demanded immediate attention, electronic warfare systems distributed across Syrian and Lebanese ground sites were mapping with surgical precision the exact frequencies, pulse patterns, and emission characteristics of the F-35's APG-81 radars. In simple terms, the Iranians used their own fighter as bait to create what military experts call an electromagnetic signature library, a detailed catalogue of the emissions the F-35 makes when it's operating in active combat mode. With this data, developing specific electronic countermeasures becomes not just possible, but relatively straightforward. Israeli intelligence sources, speaking on condition of anonymity to specialized defense publications, reported that the moment the magnitude of what had happened became clear was at 4:02 a.m., when signal analysts in Glilot realized that multiple listening systems were active simultaneously along a 340-kilometer corridor. It wasn't an isolated operation. It was a coordinated sensor network, likely involving cooperation between Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, and possibly even Russian consultants, all working in sync to extract maximum signals intelligence from that brief engagement. A senior Israeli Air Force officer was reportedly quoted in a classified briefing as saying, "They turned our own air superiority system into an intelligence transmitter. Every second we kept radar active was a second of data they collected about our most sensitive capabilities." The implication is devastating. The F-35, designed to be invisible and lethal, was momentarily turned into an intelligence source for the adversary simply by having to do its job of identifying and tracking a threat. This isn't a failure of the F-35 itself. It's a conceptual failure of how the United States thinks about air superiority in an era where adversaries can create tactical dilemmas that force stealth platforms to sacrifice their primary advantage to perform basic missions. But let's dig even deeper, because this is where the story gets truly unsettling for Pentagon planners. The Kausar program didn't start as a cutting-edge fighter project. It began in 2013 as an effort to reverse engineer the American F-5 Tiger, a third-generation light fighter that Iran had acquired before the 1979 revolution. The initial assumption was that the Iranians were merely trying to keep obsolete aircraft operational through parts cannibalization and makeshift manufacturing. But leaked technical documents in 2021 from a joint venture between Iranian defense organizations and Chinese entities revealed something entirely different. The Kausar was a technological Trojan horse, a project that allowed Iran to build complete industrial infrastructure for advanced aerospace production under the guise of maintaining legacy systems. While Western analysts scoffed at propaganda images showing the first Kausar in 2018, Iranian engineers were actually finalizing the third-generation internal design, each iteration incorporating lessons learned from downed American drones, electronic systems acquired through clandestine supply chains, and knowledge transfer from Russian and Chinese experts operating through front companies. The total cost of the program by 2025 was estimated at $680 million, spread over 12 years. To put that in brutal perspective, the F-35 program has already consumed over $7 trillion, and still grapples with critical maintenance issues, parts availability, and software deficiencies that drive operational readiness rates below 55% for some variants. Iran, a country with a GDP of $388 billion and under the heaviest sanctions ever imposed on a modern nation, managed to develop a platform that can create operational dilemmas for the most expensive weapons system in American history for 0.04% of the cost. This math should be causing insomnia for every member of the House Armed Services Committee, because it reveals a strategic truth that Washington has been avoiding confronting. More money doesn't necessarily mean more capability, and determined adversaries will find asymmetric ways to neutralize technological advantages through operational creativity and engineering focused on solving specific problems rather than chasing excellence across all domains simultaneously. And here we need to pause the narrative flow to reflect on what this truly means for the regional balance of power. We're not talking about experimental technology that may or may not work under controlled conditions. We're talking about a system that has already been tested in real operational conditions against adversaries operating fifth-generation equipment. We're talking about a clear demonstration that decades of American investment in stealth and technological superiority can be circumvented by strategies that exploit the inherent vulnerabilities of these systems when forced to operate in high-intensity scenarios. If you're following this analysis and picking up on the profound implications for global security, let me know in the comments. Do you think the United States has systematically underestimated the capacity of sanctioned adversaries to develop competitive military technology? Your perspective helps gauge whether this was an isolated surprise or a symptom of broader strategic blindness. But let's return to what happened in the immediate hours after the incident. At 05:34 a.m., just 2 hours after the engagement, the Iranian Ministry of Defense released an extremely unusual statement. No claims of victory. No dramatic videos, just a single line declaring that Kausar fighters had completed routine patrol over Syrian airspace in coordination with local authorities. This restraint was deliberate and revealing. Analysts immediately noted that, unlike previous incidents where Iran amplified any confrontation with Israel for domestic consumption, this time there was near official silence. The reason? Tehran didn't want Washington to fully understand what had just transpired before more data could be gathered from future engagements. Western intelligence sources reported that it wasn't until 72 hours later, when NSA analysts completed forensic analysis of signal intercepts, that the magnitude of the intelligence-gathering operation became apparent. What appeared to be a single fighter on patrol was, in fact, the central node of a distributed sensor network that included ground-based radars, mobile electronic warfare systems, high-altitude drones, and even reconnaissance satellites provided by China through data-sharing agreements. The reaction within the Israeli inner security circle was one of contained but profound alarm. A classified memo circulated among senior IDF commanders 3 days after the incident reportedly stated, "If an adversary can force our fifth-generation systems to compromise stealth to complete basic interception missions, the premise of unquestioned air superiority upon which we base our defense doctrine needs to be re-evaluated." Israel has spent $7 billion over the last 2 decades building a fleet of 50 F-35I Adirs, modified with Israeli systems, and optimized for the Middle East threat environment. These fighters are the backbone of Israel's ability to project power and maintain deterrence against existential threats. If this capability can be systematically degraded or mapped through operations like the one at 03:17 a.m., Israel's entire security architecture faces a structural vulnerability that additional money or more F-35s cannot fix. And this is where the story connects to something much bigger happening in American defense acquisitions that most people aren't paying attention to. The Pentagon has spent the last 2 decades betting trillions of dollars on exquisite platforms. Extraordinarily capable but also extraordinarily expensive and complex weapon systems that take decades to develop and require massive global supply chains to keep operational. The F-35 is the most visible example, but the same philosophy permeates Zumwalt-class destroyers costing $4 billion apiece, Virginia-class submarines hitting $45 billion per unit, and Ford-class aircraft carriers exceeding $13 billion each. Meanwhile, adversaries like Iran, China, and Russia are developing what military strategists call good-enough systems, platforms that aren't technologically superior to American equivalents, but are sufficiently capable to create operational dilemmas, cheap enough to be produced in large quantities, and simple enough to be kept operational even under adverse conditions. The 3:17 a.m. incident is a perfect microcosm of this strategic divergence. A $25 million Iranian fighter jet forced a response from $115 million Israeli fighter jets, and in the process, extracted intelligence data that could be worth hundreds of millions in future countermeasure development. The asymmetric math is brutal. Iran can produce 4-6 Kausars for the price of a single F-35I. Even if each Kausar is individually inferior in capability, 5 of them operating in coordination can create tactical scenarios where F-35s are forced to make difficult choices between preserving stealth and completing missions. And every engagement is an opportunity to collect more data, refine countermeasures, and develop more effective tactics. This turns the very process of air superiority into an exercise in progressively degrading technological advantage. But there's another aspect to this story that isn't getting enough attention, and it's absolutely critical to understanding where the Middle East is headed in the coming years. The Kausar program isn't just Iranian. It's the first exportable product of a new category of South-South defense cooperation that completely bypasses Western systems. Intelligence sources report that Syria is already in talks to acquire an export variant of the Kausar, with financing provided through Russian credit lines and Chinese technical assistance to establish local maintenance capabilities. Hezbollah is reportedly receiving technology transfer for ground-based electronic warfare systems derived from the Kausar's sensors. Even Yemen, devastated by years of civil war, is in exploratory talks about licensing specific components. What we are witnessing is the emergence of an alternative defense ecosystem, where nations under Western sanctions share technology, expertise, and industrial capacity to build collective deterrence against American or Israeli intervention. This ecosystem has a defining characteristic. It's designed specifically to deny dominance, not to achieve it. The goal isn't to defeat F-35s in direct air combat. It's to make American and Israeli air operations so expensive, risky, and politically unsustainable that military intervention becomes a less attractive option for Washington and Tel Aviv. It's about transforming the Middle East into an anti-access, area denial environment, where even the world's most advanced militaries face constant operational dilemmas that degrade effectiveness and increase risks to politically unacceptable levels. And it's working. Leaked classified CENTCOM analyses from 2024 showed that American military planners now estimate that any large-scale air operation against Iran would require a 3 to 4 week suppression of enemy air defenses campaign before precision strikes could begin, compared to estimates of 48 to 72 hours made in 2015. This dramatic shift reflects not just improvements in Iranian air defenses, but the integration of systems that create exponential operational complexity. And now comes the part that should be causing silent panic in the Pentagon's corridors. If Iran achieved this under the most severe sanctions of the modern world, what has China achieved with virtually unlimited resources and access to global supply chains? What has Russia learned from years of real combat in Ukraine about exploiting vulnerabilities in Western systems? We are entering an era where American technological advantage, which has underpinned global hegemony since 1991, is being systematically eroded not by revolutionary advances from adversaries, but by incremental engineering focused on creating favorable asymmetries. The COSAR isn't a better fighter than the F-35. It's a fighter designed to make the F-35 a worse investment. That distinction is everything. 3 weeks after the incident, the Israeli Minister of Defense convened a classified meeting with the CEOs of Israel Aerospace Industries and Elbit Systems to discuss accelerating defensive electronic warfare programs. Sources present at the meeting reported the conversation was dominated by an uncomfortable question. Did Israel need to fundamentally rethink its reliance on American fifth-generation platforms in favor of a more diversified mix that included cheaper fourth-generation fighters equipped with advanced electronic suites? The discussion did not reach definitive conclusions, but the mere fact that it was happening reveals how profoundly the 3:17 a.m. incident had shaken strategic certainties. Israel has always based its security on qualitative superiority over numerically superior adversaries. If that superiority can be neutralized through asymmetric tactics and sophisticated electronic warfare, the entire Israeli defense model faces a conceptual crisis. In the United States, the reaction was more muted publicly, but equally concerned behind closed doors. The F-35 program is too big to fail, both politically and economically. Over 200 fighters have already been ordered by 18 allied nations. Cancelling or making dramatic changes would create a massive diplomatic crisis and devastate the American defense industrial base. But continuing as if nothing had changed would be strategic negligence. The emerging consensus appears to be accelerating the development of electronic countermeasures, investing heavily in artificial intelligence for real-time threat processing, and quietly accepting that F-35s will increasingly need to operate in environments where stealth is degraded or compromised. This doesn't make the F-35 obsolete, but it fundamentally shifts its value proposition from an invulnerable air dominance platform to a highly capable but vulnerable system requiring massive electronic warfare support, suppression of enemy air defenses, and information superiority to operate effectively. And here's the last layer of this story we need to examine: the psychological and political impact on America's regional allies. Saudi Arabia was in talks to acquire F-35s as part of a normalization deal with Israel brokered by Washington. The United Arab Emirates recently finalized the acquisition of 50 F-35s for $23 billion. Qatar, Bahrain, and even Egypt were exploring future acquisitions. All these nations are now watching the 3:17 a.m. incident and doing some very uncomfortable calculations. If we spend tens of billions on fifth-generation fighters, and Iran can neutralize that advantage with creative engineering and asymmetric tactics. Are we really buying security, or just enriching American defense contractors while remaining vulnerable? This question has no easy answer, but it's being asked in war rooms from Riyadh to Abu Dhabi to Doha. What makes this even more complicated is that these countries can't just abandon defense partnerships with the United States. The entire regional security architecture of the Gulf is built on American assurances and arms sales, but they can start diversifying, buying Russian and Chinese systems, developing domestic capabilities through technology transfer, and building collective defense networks that lessen reliance on any single supplier. We're already seeing signs of this. The Emirates bought Russian S-400 air defense systems, despite American pressure. Saudi Arabia is developing domestic military drone production capabilities with Chinese assistance. Kuwait is exploring the purchase of French Rafale fighters instead of waiting for American approval for F-35s. Each of these decisions is a vote of diminished confidence in America's ability to provide security solutions that actually work against real threats, rather than existing solely in PowerPoint simulations at the Pentagon. So, where does this leave us? The 3:17 a.m. incident was not a military defeat for Israel or the United States. No aircraft were shot down, no missions failed, no lives were lost. But it was potentially something more significant. A public demonstration that the era of unquestioned American and Israeli air superiority over the Middle East might be ending, not with a decisive battle, but with 1,000 incremental cuts from adversaries who have learned to exploit the systemic vulnerabilities of exquisite platforms operating in hostile environments. What we saw was Iran turning limitations into advantages, sanctions into innovation, and technological inferiority into operational creativity. While the United States spent trillions chasing multi-domain dominance, Iran spent hundreds of millions developing good enough capabilities to deny Americans the benefits of that dominance. The real question now isn't whether the F-35 is a good fighter. It is. The question is whether the United States and its allies are prepared to operate in a world where adversaries have learned to create dilemmas that force even the best weapon systems into difficult choices that expose their vulnerabilities. The question is whether Washington can adapt to an era of great power competition, where unlimited money no longer guarantees victory, where adversaries find asymmetric ways to level the playing field, and where technology alone isn't enough without creative operational strategy and a willingness to accept risks that Americans increasingly avoid. The 3:17 a.m. incident was a test of this new reality. And the results should be causing sleepless nights for anyone responsible for maintaining American military superiority for the decades to come. If this analysis has shifted your perspective on the balance of power in the Middle East, subscribe to the channel, because we will continue to unravel the seismic shifts in geopolitics that mainstream media ignores. And share this video with anyone interested in understanding how weaker adversaries are learning to beat stronger ones through creative engineering and asymmetric strategic thinking. The future of warfare will not be decided by who has the most advanced technology, but by who best knows how to exploit the vulnerabilities of the most advanced systems.